The restaurant buzzed with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from a distant table. It was the kind of place where people came to escape the world for a little while, to share a meal, to celebrate, or simply to forget their worries. But tonight, something felt different. Marcus, a young waiter with steady hands and a warm smile, had worked here for years. He had seen all kinds of people walk through those doors, some kind, some rude, some who barely noticed him. But he had learned to treat everyone the same, no matter who they were. It was just another shift, another night of balancing trays and remembering orders, until he saw the man in the wheelchair. The gentleman sat alone at a small table near the window, his eyes scanning the menu with careful precision. He had an air of quiet dignity, his movements slow but deliberate. His suit was neat, though a little worn at the edges, and his silver hair was combed back with care. There was something about him, something Marcus couldn't quite place. As he approached, Marcus greeted him with his usual warmth. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" The man looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes for the first time. There was a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps. Or was it surprise? It was gone as quickly as it came. "A coffee," the man said, his voice deep but gentle. "Black." Marcus nodded, scribbling it down. "Right away." The rest of the service went smoothly. The man ate in silence, occasionally glancing around the restaurant as if lost in thought. Marcus refilled his coffee without being asked. And when the meal was over, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. Marcus expected him to hand over a tip or maybe a note for the bill. Instead, the man extended the paper toward him. "For you," he said simply. Marcus hesitated before taking it. The paper was old, slightly yellowed at the edges. His fingers unfolded it carefully, his heart suddenly pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. And then, as his eyes scanned the faded ink, his breath caught in his throat. The words on the newspaper clipping made his hands tremble. Marcus stared at the newspaper clipping, his pulse quickening. The headline was faded, the ink smudged in places, but the words were clear enough to send a chill down his spine. He read it again, his fingers tightening around the fragile paper. This didn't make sense. Why was this man giving it to him? And more importantly, how did it have anything to do with him? His mind raced as he glanced back at the man in the wheelchair. The old gentleman watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, a knowing look, as if he was waiting for Marcus to connect the dots. Marcus swallowed hard. "What is this?" His voice was quieter than he intended. The man took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "You don't recognize it." Marcus shook his head, but something about the words on the page felt oddly familiar. He skimmed over the text again, searching for a clue. It was an old news report, a story about an event that had happened years ago. The kind of story most people would forget over time. But for some reason, this man thought Marcus should remember. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "You will." A strange unease settled in Marcus's chest. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but something about the man's tone made him hesitate. It was like the man was waiting for him to figure it out on his own. He looked back at the article, scanning the words more carefully. A name caught his eye, his stomach clenched. It wasn't his name, but it was close. Too close. A shiver ran down his spine. He glanced up again, trying to read the man's face, but the old gentleman just gave a small, knowing smile. "I'm sure you have questions," the man said. "But first tell me, do you believe in fate?" Marcus didn't answer. He wasn't sure what he believed in right now. All he knew was that whatever this was, it wasn't a coincidence. This man had come here for a reason, and somehow Marcus was part of it. The restaurant around them felt suddenly distant, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into the background. It was just the two of them now, and Marcus had the unsettling feeling that his life was about to change forever. Marcus couldn't shake the cold knot forming in his stomach. His fingers twitched as he set the newspaper clipping down on the table, careful not to crumple the delicate paper. He wanted to walk away, pretend this moment never happened, but something told him that wasn't an option. The house came into view, a weathered structure at the end of a long driveway, its windows dark, its porch sagging from years of neglect. Marcus pulled in, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. The sedan slowed but didn't turn in. Instead, it parked just up the street, its shadowed form barely visible in the dim glow of a distant street lamp. Marcus clenched his jaw, pushing the fear aside. He stepped out of the car, the key a cold weight in his palm. He climbed the creaking steps and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit hallway covered in dust. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of something long abandoned. Marcus hesitated, then stepped in, his shoes leaving faint prints on the dusty wooden floor. He moved carefully, his fingers brushing along the walls. Old pictures lined the hallway, their glass frames covered in grime. He wiped one clean, and his breath caught. It was his mother, younger, smiling. Beside her stood a man, his father. The same man from the photograph Charles had given him. His stomach clenched as he moved deeper into the house. The living room was almost untouched, as if someone had left in a hurry. Papers were scattered on the coffee table. An old wooden chest sat against the wall. Marcus knelt in front of it, his heart pounding. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were folders, documents, a stack of letters tied with twine. His fingers trembled as he picked one up. It was addressed to him. Before he could open it, a noise behind him made him freeze. A slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards. Marcus turned sharply, his pulse hammering. A figure stood in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. Charles. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "You weren't supposed to come alone," he said quietly. Marcus swallowed. "Who's in the car outside?" Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his expression darkening. "They're here to make sure you don't leave." Marcus's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Charles exhaled, his gaze shifting to the chest. "Because what's in there isn't just the past. It's proof, and some people will do anything to keep it buried." A chill crawled down Marcus's spine. He looked back at the letters, the documents. The truth was right in front of him. But now he wasn't sure if he'd live long enough to read it. Marcus's breath was shallow, his mind racing. Charles's words lingered in the air, thick with warning. He glanced down at the chest, at the letters, at the proof that someone didn't want him to find. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a steady drum of fear and adrenaline. Outside, the distant rumble of a car door shutting sent a jolt through him. Whoever had been watching was no longer waiting. Marcus looked at Charles, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do?" Charles's jaw tightened. "You take what matters and you run." Marcus didn't hesitate. His hands moved fast, grabbing as many of the papers as he could, shoving them into his jacket, into his pockets. His fingers brushed across a small envelope with his name scrawled in faded ink. He hesitated, then tucked it inside his coat. A sharp knock echoed through the house. The man in the wheelchair studied him in silence, waiting. There was patience in his eyes, but also something deeper, something that made Marcus uneasy. "Who are you?" Marcus finally asked. His voice was steady, but inside, his thoughts were a tangled mess. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his coffee, lifting it with careful hands. He took a slow sip before placing the cup back down, the ceramic making a soft clinking sound against the table. Then he looked up. "My name is Charles," he said, "but that's not what matters." Marcus frowned. "Then what does?" Charles gestured toward the newspaper clipping. "That." Marcus hesitated, then looked at the faded article again. He skimmed the words, picking out small details: an old crime, a missing person, a tragedy that had gone unanswered for years. The name that had caught his eye earlier wasn't his, but it was close enough to feel personal. A memory stirred in the back of his mind, blurry and distant, like a dream just out of reach. He was just a child when it happened, too young to understand, too young to ask questions. But he remembered whispers, hushed conversations between his mother and a man he had never met. He remembered the way she looked over her shoulder, always afraid of something Marcus couldn't see. His throat tightened. "Why are you showing me this?" Charles exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "Because you deserve to know the truth." Marcus shook his head. "Truth about what?" Charles didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something else, a small, worn photograph. He slid it across the table. Marcus hesitated before picking it up. His breath caught the second his eyes landed on the image. It was an old picture, slightly faded, but the faces were clear. A man stood in the center, his arm draped protectively around a woman. And in front of them was a little boy. Marcus felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. Because that little boy was him. His hands tightened around the edges of the photo. His pulse roared in his ears. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. Charles leaned forward slightly. "It will." Marcus forced himself to breathe, to think. He had never seen this picture before. And yet, it was proof of something. Something big. Something his mother had never told him. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Charles's expression softened, but there was something heavy in his eyes. "They're the people who fought to protect you." Marcus's heart pounded. Protect me from what? Charles took a deep breath. From the past. Marcus shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "That's not an answer." Charles studied him for a long moment. Then in a low voice, he said, "It is. You just don't know what it means yet." Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had spent his whole life believing he knew where he came from, who he was. But now, he wasn't so sure. And as he looked at the photograph, then back at the newspaper clipping, one thought haunted him. What if everything he thought he knew had been a lie? Marcus felt his hands trembling as he placed the photograph on the table, his pulse pounding in his ears. His thoughts were racing too fast to hold on to anything solid. Every instinct told him to get up, to leave, to pretend none of this was happening. But he couldn't move. Something in Charles's voice, in his eyes, in the weight of that old newspaper clipping, held him in place. He swallowed hard. "You keep saying I need to know the truth. So tell me, no more riddles." Charles exhaled, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "It's not that simple." Marcus's frustration flared. "It is that simple. You walk in here, hand me a newspaper article, give me a picture of myself that I've never seen before. What do you expect me to do with that?" Charles looked at him, his gaze steady but heavy with something Marcus couldn't quite name. "I expect you to remember." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Remember what?" Charles was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out something smaller, a key. He placed it on the table between them. Marcus stared at it. It was old, the metal worn and slightly rusted. "What's this?" "The key to a place that holds answers," Charles said. "A place that was left behind for you." Marcus shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing this? Who are you to me?" Charles hesitated. For the first time, his carefully controlled expression faltered, just a little. "I knew your parents," he said finally. "And I made a promise to them." Marcus felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. The front door creaked slightly, as if someone was testing it. "Back door," Charles whispered. "Now." Marcus moved quickly, following Charles through the darkened house. The back door was stiff, but Charles pushed it open just as a heavy boot slammed against the front entrance. Marcus stepped into the night, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He didn't stop to think. He ran. Behind him, voices erupted, shouts, the sound of wood splintering. He didn't look back. Charles was right behind him, his steps steady, leading him through the overgrown yard toward a narrow alley that cut between old buildings. They didn't stop running until they reached a quiet street a few blocks away. Marcus leaned against a wall, trying to catch his breath. Charles stood beside him, eyes scanning the empty road. After a moment, Charles finally spoke. "They won't stop looking for you now." Marcus swallowed, his fingers still gripping the papers in his pockets. "Why?" Charles turned to him, his face grave. "Because the truth isn't just about your past. It's about theirs, and they'll do anything to keep it buried." Marcus looked down at the envelope tucked inside his coat. He had no idea what was inside, but he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same.